All right, here we go with another lecture here, this time in regards to the Constitution of the United States. And there's kind of 6 guiding principles that are you deal with in the Constitution, and so that's sort of where we're going to be focused today. And we'll go to the first slide. This will be one of the first times, too, that we're going to bounce around to some different screens when we are doing this. And so it should be kind of a little bit different than in the past. But regardless, we're talking about the Constitution, and one of the things that is unique about our Constitution is that it's been around for a very long time. So in June of 1788, it was formally ratified. And again, obviously, you can do some math to realize that's a very, very long period of time in which our Constitution has been functioning. One of the things that's sort of unique about our Constitution, it is considered to be the supreme law of the land. So if there's ever a question as to whether or not a law or any rule that we make in our country or the way we're governing is handled, we're going to go to the Constitution as a little bit of a final justification for that. And we'll talk about kind of the role. That's one of the principles in this concept, is how that gets handled. But the idea that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land is kind of a critical element. James Madison is our primary author. Again, it is a little bit interesting that, and again, I think we've referenced it in class previously, but is this idea that James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, two very close friends in many respects, although later in their life they do run into some arguments, but again, in general, they're both from Virginia. They're both landowners. They're both slave owners, which is probably an important piece to the puzzle. But these two gentlemen, wrote arguably the two most important documents in American history, Jefferson in the Declaration and James Madison in the Constitution. And Madison did it at a very young age. I want to say, and I'm guessing a little bit here, but I think he was in his late 30s when he wrote the Constitution, 38 or 39, which sometimes when you're my age, you start to think, what have I done? But at any rate, James Madison is the primary writer and author of the Constitution, and so is known as, in some respects, the father of the Constitution. So that's kind of a little bit of background, and let's get into the 6 principles. And the first is something called popular sovereignty. And again, the key element here is that the United States, or inside the United States, the people are the source of the power that occurs in our government. And the Constitution defines it, and it defines it in the preamble. We're going to go to the Constitution here very quickly. And we're going to use that America's Governing page, which you guys have used. And actually, this is one of your assignments. But I just wanted to kind of show you right here, and you guys have heard it, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution for the United States of America. Again, we the people being the critical element here as far as popular sovereignty. Also, if you'll remember, if we go back into our first unit and talk about what are things that government is supposed to do for us. We talked about defending our borders, and we talked about dealing with general welfare, securing us. All those things are mentioned here. And again, this is in that social contract theory, right? This Constitution is written in that form that the people are going to work together to make that happen. So again, just kind of an interesting thing that is defined, and probably the most important part of the Constitution is defined in that first phrase, we the people of the United States. So again, this is a good idea. We're going to go back and forth between the Constitution during this lecture, but again, this is something that's right there for you. Okay, going ahead here to the second, and this is something you've probably heard of, this idea that we do have separation of powers in our government. And, we sort of, at times, I think, maybe take some of this stuff for granted. But the key element in the way our government is set up is that there are 3 distinct branches of government. And so we actually are going to work starting on the far right. Because that's the branch that's mentioned in Article 1, and that is our legislative branch. Now, you do need to make some additions to the notes here. Again, this is where you can go annotate, or if you've printed these out. But a couple things you want to keep in mind. When we talk about the legislative branch, we are talking about 2 house part of our legislature. One of the houses is the Senate, and then the other house is the House of Representatives. One of the things that sometimes gets a little bit unclear, and again, I remember as a student being a little bit, it caused me problems as I was trying to remember how this thing functioned. But when you hear the term Congress, or when we refer to congressmen, congresswomen, congressperson, what we're talking about there is the House of Representatives. When we talk about senators, then we're talking about the Senate, okay? And so sometimes that gets sort of thrown in, and people will often mistakenly say that Congress is one of the three branches. Well, that's not true. It's a part of one of the three. So Congress is the House of Representatives. And so if underneath that legislative branch you drew, two little lines and you put the House of Representatives and the Senate, that's kind of what we're looking for there. Now the Senate, to determine the way that we do representation in the Senate is that there are 2 senators for every state in our United States. So there's a total of 100 senators. California has 2. What's unique about California senators? Well, they're both women. Sort of an unusual situation in our state that we have 2 women that are the 2 senators. Again, we're the only state that has that. There aren't a lot of women in the Senate in general. I think there's somewhere between 14 and 16 women, and we have 2 from our state. That's Barbara Boxer and Dianne Feinstein. In the House of Representatives, representation is determined by population. And so you've got a situation where there are 435 members of the House of Representatives. California has the most. We have 55 in the House of Representatives. Some states have as few as 1. And again, that's a pretty common thing. Actually, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, those states have single representatives. And again, why? Because no one lives there. Or frankly, Wyoming has less than 600,000 people. More people live in Anaheim than live in Wyoming. So to give you an idea of why California has so much representation, that's why. The other thing that's important to note is that when they decided to write the Constitution, the legislative branch was done first. And so if you go to Article 1, Section 1, it talks about the fact that all legislative power shall be vested in Congress. And then it says, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. The whole thing, all this, and I'm scrolling quickly, there's no way you could read this fast, but all of this material here about the congressional or legislative branch is broken down. It talks about how bills are passed. It talks about all the rules in regards to what types of responsibilities they're going to have. It talks about the representation and how that's built. All that stuff is done in Article 1. And so as you go through here, you could get a gauge of all the pieces of the way that the legislative branch functions. But again, the writers of the Constitution intentionally, James Madison intentionally put this first so that we can get that squared away, okay? And so that they felt like if they put that legislative branch first, it would really focus on them. And their idea was to spread out power, right? To be more democratic. They're trying to avoid this idea of a king or a monarchy because that's the government they had just left. And so they wanted to use that legislative branch for this purpose. Okay, going back here. Our second branch and that we'll go to is the executive. So we're kind of skipping over to the other side here. But the executive branch obviously is our president, our vice president, and the president's cabinet. Now, one of the things that happens in here is that this branch has really expanded to include most of the bureaucracy in government because it's the job of the legislative branch to make law. The executive branch's job is to execute the law. And again, this will be something that we sort of continue to talk about as we go through the class, as we build into each branch separately. But as we're in the separation of powers moment, the legislative branch is the one that makes law. The executive branch has to carry it out or execute it. That's the word, executive. And so, it's something to keep in mind that bureaucracy, the Internal Revenue Service, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the Pentagon, all those things fall into the executive branch. So most of the people who work for our government, at least the federal government, work in the executive area, okay? So that huge bureaucracy, all those government workers are in that department. What you really want to make sure you write down here is the president, the vice president, and his cabinet. That's what's defined under the executive branch. And so something to keep in mind. And this is in Article 2. So we can go to Article 2, which is right here. And it says the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. and it talks about his term length, and then it talks about the fact that the vice president, same term, to be elected as follows. And it goes through a process here of electing the president. And again, this is that really confusing electoral college. We'll get to that a little bit later. It talks about some of the rules and responsibilities that the president has. As you scroll through here, Section 2 starts to define his roles and responsibilities, and it moves all the way down. Now, there's only 4 sections that deal with the president, and again, it's sort of funny because we think about the role the president has now. It's certainly expanded over time, but early on, again, they're trying to minimize how much responsibility the president has because they don't want a monarch. They are very concerned about that. In fact, so the majority of Article 2 is written about how we elect a president. That's this area here. You can see me kind of circling around it that talks about the electoral college system. Again, kind of an antiquated system we use to elect our president. So again, you want to get down here on your notes, make sure that you get in the executive branch, president, vice president, cabinet, bureaucracy, and then of course that this is done in Article 2. The third branch is our judicial branch, and this is kind of a unique thing because the court systems have expanded rather rapidly in our country over the past few years, but the judicial branch is what we would normally consider to be the Supreme Court. Those 9 justices that serve to evaluate whether laws made in our country meet the rules of the Constitution. This is going to be a power or a principle of the Constitution we're going to talk about later. But that Supreme Court is what is part of this judicial branch. It also includes all other federal courts. And again, this is where the expansion has come. There are all kinds of federal courts now that deal with everything from bankruptcies to situations where a state may sue another state, or one person from one state sues someone from another state. I mean, there's all kinds of different things, or any violations of the Constitution are all going to be handled by federal court. It's also the place where you're going to have any crimes like kidnapping, drug trafficking, that kind of thing, because those things occur across state lines, and anything that occurs across state lines is going to turn into an interstate situation, which ultimately is interstate commerce and the federal government handles. So that's where the judicial branch is going to go. Again, Supreme Court's at the top. That's our final word as far as our court is concerned in the United States, and then all the federal courts that fall below are in that judicial branch. Now, again, quickly going back to our Constitution, we'll get down to Article 3. Here we go. This is where the judicial branch is dealt with. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. So that Supreme Court was first, and then over time the Congress or the legislative branch has established additional courts, okay? And so that's been expanded to include other courts around, throughout the federal system, okay? Again, my advice to you is to stay out of federal court. Those are the kind of courts you don't want to be in, especially if you're a defendant. You don't want to be involved in federal court. That generally means you went on a multi-state killing spree or something. We don't want that for you in your future, so try and avoid federal court. Checks and balances. This is probably one thing you've heard of. This is, I think, our third principle here. And again, this is the idea that each of those branches we just mentioned has the ability to in some way or another, control power over the other. And again, I've listed 4 here, but there are dozens of other examples that are built into the Constitution. And, some of these ones are ones we are very familiar with probably. And the most obviously is the presidential veto, this idea that if a law is passed in our legislative branch, that the president can veto that law, which basically means the president doesn't sign it, and that law is not a law. It gets kicked back into the legislative branch. They do have an opportunity to override a presidential veto, but it does take 2/3 of a vote. And again, that's very difficult to achieve, especially in today's political climate. It's very rare. So ultimately, if a president is going to veto a law at this point, generally that's the end of it. But it can be done. We think about other areas of checks and balances. One of the things is that our president is allowed to go out and deal with other countries and form treaties, but the Senate must approve them. Again, probably the most famous, or one of the most famous ones you've probably heard of at least, is during the end of World War I, when Woodrow Wilson went out and put together the Treaty of Versailles and his 19-point plan to try and end the war. One of the things that was going to be included in that was a League of Nations. And President Wilson felt like if there was a League of Nations that worked together to try and keep people out of war, that would be beneficial to the whole world. Well, when he got back home, President Wilson actually had a stroke and was unable to really defend his ideas in the Senate, and the Senate did not approve the Treaty of Versailles, and so the United States stayed out of that particular treaty. Our inability or unwillingness to get involved probably led to the start of World War II in that outset, and again allowed Germany to rebuild, etc., and Hitler to rise. So again, that can be a big deal that the Senate must approve treaties. As far as another one that's out there is judges. The federal judgeships are appointed by the president. Now, at the lower courts, generally the Senate approves them very swiftly. There's not a lot to them. But when we get to Supreme Court justices, it's a much bigger deal. President Obama has appointed one judge. She did get confirmed. And we'll talk about the difficulty in this process a little bit later on in class when we get to the judicial branch. But again, this is an important element to checks and balances, especially if the Senate is not in the same political party as the president. This can be very touch and go. And, it's one of these things that becomes very important. Now, one of the things that you do need to know as well at this point is that that Supreme Court justices are in for life. And so it becomes a really, really important choice of who you put into office. And so the Senate gets heavily involved. There's generally hearings and other things that go along with it. But again, this is another element of checks and balances. Again, there are several others. These are just four. And it's good to know these. Again, you probably were familiar with some going in. Okay, judicial review. And this is another principle that was established. Again, this isn't necessarily written in the Constitution necessarily, but very quickly it became something that was critically important, and we talk about this all the time, and we'll talk about several of these laws that come to mind here. But the idea here is that the Supreme Court, or our judicial branch, has power to decide if actions taken by the government are in accordance with the Constitution. This has become the primary power of the Supreme Court. Yeah, they hear all types of federal cases, but most of the time, the cases are dealing with whether or not some law is in accordance with the Constitution. And this was established in a court case of Marbury versus Madison. Yes, that is James Madison, the writer of the Constitution. And I'm not going to get into the details of this case. It is a little bit confusing. But what's important to note here is that the Supreme Court, for the first time in this case, established this idea of judicial review. They ruled on that court case based on the fact that the persons were acting outside of the rules of the Constitution. Now we have cases like this all the time, and this becomes very, very important. Certainly issues regarding freedom of speech, issues regarding privacy, issues regarding when it's okay to search and seize things from your residence. All those types of things are handled by our Supreme Court, and that judicial review process is something that becomes, again, I think maybe one of the more interesting elements to our government, especially because over time their viewpoints have changed. And so as our country has evolved and adjusted to size and scope, and we've gone through many changes over these last 200 plus years the Constitution has been in existence. The Supreme Court has had can have a pretty influential role in making these decisions. And so this judicial review becomes really, really critical. And we'll give you a lot of court case examples as we go through as well to kind of give you some feel for this. But again, this is established in the court case of Marbury versus Madison. Okay, another really important element is the idea of federalism. And federalism is the division of power between the federal government and then state and local governments. And so, again, I drew a little bit here of kind of a hierarchy so you can see, but this is a critical part of our Constitution. And that is that our federal government has certain rights and responsibilities that it deals with. Again, these are listed in the Constitution. They very specifically say some of the things that we do. And so those are things that are expressly written in the document. They're called expressed powers, and we'll get into more details on federalism here over the next few days. But the idea that our federal government exists, and then we also have responsibilities that are held at the state, county, and city level. The arguments over what should be handled at the federal and state level exist. Certainly they go back and forth. We're going to look at gay marriage, for example. Again, this marriage is determined by the states. It's not determined by the federal government. When you go and decide that you want to be married, not only do you go to the state, each individual county and city may have specific rules as to how you go about the process of getting married. But it's a state decision. Each individual state gets to decide whether or not 2 men, 2 women, 10 men, 10 women, that's up to the states. There is nothing the federal government has to do with that particular topic. So again, kind of a unique thing here in our country that it's sort of separate. Sometimes the federal government and the state governments work together. Typically this is in law enforcement and things of that nature, right? The police may work in conjunction with the FBI, that type of thing. But for the most part, there's very specific rules, things that are followed at the state and federal level. School system comes to mind. Public schools are, for the most part, handled by the states, although federal money does trickle down into those areas. But the states and the counties and the cities and our local school districts are in charge of running the school system, what's supposed to be taught, how that's supposed to work. So all that stuff gets handled there. One kind of unique example where at times the federal government will kind of manipulate this, and I'll give you an example where I grew up in Oregon when I was in high school in 1988. I'll give you an idea of my age. But in 1988, there was a law that basically said that each individual state could determine how old you had to be to drink alcoholic beverages. Well, at that time, several states had the rule so that you could be 18. If you were 18 years old, you could drink. And one of the states that did that was Idaho. I lived in eastern Oregon, about 5 hours from the Idaho border. And so when I was a younger high school student, several of my classmates that were 18 would drive from Oregon across the border into Idaho, and they would go to bars on the weekends and such because they were 18 and they could do it in Idaho. Well, I don't know anyone that this happened to, but in several instances of situations like this, kids that were driving across the border would drive home, maybe a little bit intoxicated, and they would crash, and there was some alcohol-related deaths and things of that nature. So to kind of manipulate the idea of federalism, where the states had the right to control the drinking age, the federal government said, hey, you can do what you want with your drinking age, but if you don't change it to 21, then we're going to take all of your money away for your interstate highways. So, you think about how many interstate highways we have, even in Southern California, Interstate 5, Interstate 10, 405, 605, 710, all those freeways. The federal government basically said, if you don't change your drinking age to 21, we're pulling your highway money. Well, it didn't take the states very long to change that because that's way too much money for them to give up. So the federal government can manipulate this a little bit. But the idea still is that there's a separation, that the federal government has some responsibilities in our country, and then the state, county, and city basically gets all the others. And again, I think the biggest one right now that we deal with, well, certainly maybe marijuana is starting to come into this a little bit, but and whether or not that should be legalized, is that a federal or state issue? And then also this idea of gay marriage. That's the one that's probably the hot button topic around our country right now, is as more and more states are starting to allow for gay marriage. Again, this idea of federalism, distinction of power between federal and then state and local governments. Finally, and our sixth and final principle is this idea that our government is limited. And it goes back to maybe what we said in the beginning, that the people have power, but the government is limited to the power which we give it as individual citizens. If we want to control our government, then we can act, we can vote, we can protest, we can write letters, we can potentially fund different candidates, whatever we want to do. We have the power to make change in our government. And sometimes that change is slow to occur, but the idea is that it can be done. And it's a really, really important element to this, that the people have the power to do it. We are defined, we are a constitutional democracy, so constitutionalism is this idea that the government must be conducted according to the rules of the Constitution and the law. And so that sort of defines the way our government works. Our political leaders, the federal government cannot act outside of that. They must be conducted in that inside the rules of the Constitution. And then finally, limited government is also included in those first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And we'll look at these more specifically, but they are the things that establish a lot of these freedoms. And as we've touched on and will continue to touch on, the Constitution probably doesn't get ratified without those first 10 amendments. That was some Bill of Rights, the other term we use for the first 10 amendments, helped to establish some very specific principles. Probably the most important is this freedom of speech element, freedom of press. All these fall in the First Amendment, and then the idea that you can't establish a religion in our country, and that type of thing. And so all those pieces fall into those first 10 amendments, and they are critical. These are the things that sort of allow our government to work. And again, if you think about freedom of speech, this idea that we have to allow, and we talked about it in our principles of democracy early on, but if you have to allow the minority in a country to have a say, we don't, the majority is going to rule, but we have to give rights to the minority. And whatever that minority might be, and no matter how much you disagree with them, they need to have rights. Just like if you fall into the minority, you want those same rights. And so it is really important that we allow that to occur. Is there something that really bothers you in class or in something our government allows or doesn't allow? Well, then fight against it, and then use that first 10 amendments, that freedom of speech, to fight in the way that you want to fight against it. But you also have to allow people to fight for what they believe in, and sort of understand that that's what makes our country so great. Those 10 amendments really do establish a lot of that limitations we place on our government. So those are your 6 principles of the Constitution. In fact, let's go really quickly. I'm going to spin ahead here, and I'm going to go really fast. I don't want to make you guys too sick. I thought they included the amendments on here. They're not on there. But regardless, it talks a little bit about the rules to add amendments, and we'll get into that as well as we progress through the Constitution unit here. Again, this is one of your assignments to answer the questions over here on the right. You can read through the Constitution and then answer the questions that are on this right side over here, much like we've done on other assignments. But those give you the idea of the 6 principles of the United States Constitution.